who is a lawyer. And then secondly, what about the House of Lords? Because there's that interesting point about the Salisbury Convention, which says that the House of Lords won't stop legislation that has been in a government's manifesto. But of course, this wasn't. In fact, the manifesto was precisely the opposite. So I think there's some interesting stuff going on. So even if they planned it, did they think it through? And I think that's a question we ask, so many times about this government on so many issues. I wonder what you think.
Well, then I think there may be among our participants at this meeting some members of the House of Lords who may wish to chip in on that. But indeed, the reaction to what Johnson is now doing is such that even two former Conservative prime ministers and others in the Conservative Party, those who are perhaps attached more than others to the principle of the rule of law, are actually outraged by this. Johnson did eliminate many of his internal opponents by removing the whip from them before the election so they couldn't stand again for the Conservative Party. Grieve, Goke, others. But he's not eliminated all criticism within the Conservative Party. And this issue may be one that triggers a rebellion which will be quite significant.
Yeah, so other people may want to sort of chip in, as you said, with that. Let me just mention one other thing, which I think is, it'd be good to know what you think the reaction in the EU is going to be, but also some interesting reaction from Washington, with Nancy Pelosi saying, hang on, anything that messes up with the Good Friday Agreement means that any trade deal you're going to do with us is going to be a non-starter. So again, you think, okay, if this was done with malice and aforethought, did they really think it through?
Yeah, I think the lack of forethought is quite a plausible theory, because Number 10, the way it operates at the moment, doesn't consult widely before taking decisions, doesn't have the normal channels that might feed in from the civil service to inform decisions in a way that previous prime ministers might have. It's very much led from the top by at least two people, and they don't always consult widely or think things through. So that's quite plausible. In terms of the EU reaction, we've heard this afternoon after the Joint Committee meeting that the EU is asking the governments to withdraw this bill by the end of the month. That's very exceptional in international negotiations. To tell your partner, withdraw this proposed legislation by a certain deadline, it's unprecedented. And that's a measure of how strongly people feel about this outside the United Kingdom.
Okay, so one other, in a sense, there is also this week, the dog that didn't bark. We had Prime Minister's questions where Keir Starmer did not pursue this issue and instead went on an aspect of the COVID crisis. Now, I noticed John Crace in The Guardian says that was the right thing to do because obviously other people were going to raise this issue in the House. But was Keir Starmer right? What do you think?
Well, far be it from me to second guess Keir Starmer on the tactics of Prime Minister's question time. But in not raising it, I think he certainly wrong-footed Johnson, who had been hoping to lead on this and tried to turn this into a culture war against Labour. Simply not raising it then wrong-footed Johnson. And it also opens it, it makes it much more easy then for Conservative critics to come to the fore. So perhaps Keir was thinking of, I'll stand back. That creates space for Conservative critics to criticise the Prime Minister to undermine him, perhaps, and let's see how far that goes. Whereas if KERR had led on that and turned it into a traditional government opposition conflict, the Tories would have rallied behind their Prime Minister, their leader. So, my judgment's out on this. KERR may have called that right.
Okay. There is that quote from Napoleon, which I can never get right. So don't when your enemy is messing up, don't interfere. Okay, so I think now let's throw it open. Now I've got a list of people who emailed in questions. So I'm going to go through them, do them in threes, and then when we've done those, there'll be a couple of rounds, and then we'll invite questions from participants who didn't email, and they can, as I hope you know, if you go to the participants button at the bottom of your thing, you can find a little icon that allows you to say that you want to ask a question, and we'll then again take those in groups of three. So the first person is Keith MacDonald. What's your question, Keith? It's going to feel a bit like the Today programme. Are you there?
Apologies, I can't see Keith being on the line. If he is there, please message in the chat box, but I will go to the next person I can find who is here.
So we've got Andrew Brown is our next one. Calling Andrew Brown.
I can't see him either, so we'll go to Karen Melbourne.
Yep, Karen Melbourne. Please. Oh, well. Gosh, they go to all that trouble of sending us in emails and then not know. Okay, well, we'll park Karen as well, and then we've got Anne Lawson-Lucas.
Ah, there we go. Yeah, Anne is here, so I'll unmute Anne.
Hooray!
Anne, we should have unmuted you now if you're able to ask your question.
Of course, if people can't connect but have emailed a question, you could always read the email that they sent.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, I've gone to Rosalind next, who's here, and I've unmuted her. So, Rosalind, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi. My first question was, do you think the government wants a no-deal Brexit? Do you think part of this is a strategy to achieve a no-deal Brexit?
Okay, and Claire Hill, I'm just trying to find now, or Anthony O'Donnell. There's Anthony, so I will unmute Anthony.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
There you are, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Richard.
Evening.
I'm a bit of a latecomer, but the question that I put down was really how any coherent future Brexit strategy is going to bring together the need to get more Labour seats in Scotland and also bring in the voters south of the border. Now, could that be one and the same thing? And I'll leave out of this any suggestion that it might be a good idea to change the leadership for Labour north of the border. We'll leave that alone. But, so, a Brexit strategy that increases seats both at Holyrood and Westminster for the party north of the border.
And I've managed to unmute Anne, so thank you for everyone pointing that out in the chat box. So Anne, are you there?
Yes.
Great. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
If I can remember rightly what it was perhaps a bit to one side of the main thrust of this meeting, but it was something along the lines of how can we best continue to demonstrate our support for the EU and cooperate in a friendly manner with the people that we want to rejoin as European partners.
Okay, so probably, do you want to respond to the questions you've heard so far? And then Harry will gather himself either to read other questions or to bring in other people. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Well, the first question is about whether the government actually wants no deal, wants to get to a position where there's no deal. I don't know, but I know that there are elements within the government and within the Conservative Party that want precisely that. As I said earlier, the neoliberal right that wants to free Britain, as they would put it, of all these pesky European regulations which, as we see it, protect workers, consumers, the environment. That's what they want to break away from. So there is that pressure within the Conservative Party, and Johnson may be playing to them at the moment, or may be committed to going that far. We don't know. He is unpredictable. The second question on our Brexit position in Scotland. Now, of course, Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain, and we sometimes forget that at our peril. In the run-up to the general election, when Labour was shuffling 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, to backing a second referendum, which it eventually did, but belatedly, there were some who were saying, but this position is going to undermine our support in the Red Wall in the north of England, and totally ignored what used to be the Red Bloc of Scotland. Now, that didn't help us in the general election in Scotland. Had we had a much stronger commitment to remain and to have a second referendum in which we would be campaigning to remain very clearly, without all those caveats, we would have done better in Scotland. We would have done better in some parts of England and Wales as well. Would we have lost more in the Red Wall? Possibly not, if we'd actually committed to that some time ago and made the case. Nobody ever went out and started to persuade our own supporters and voters in the so-called Red Wall, the Labour leavers, as it were, to vote to change their mind, to reconsider their position. If we'd been hammering away 2 years non-stop saying Brexit's turning out to be completely different from what was promised, it's turning out to be a disaster, we must reconsider, and made the arguments going into those details, we would have lost fewer of those Labour Leave voters. And remember, Labour Leave voters were always a minority of Labour voters. Most Labour voters were Remainers. So our ambiguity didn't do us any good at all. And that's something we need to bear in mind again now, even though Brexit has happened, but there is still a lot at stake. And Scotland is a prime place where that should remind us of this. And then the third question from Anne, what can we do to demonstrate our support for closer relations with Europe? Well, in that we are at the moment as a country supposed to be negotiating a deal, I think we should say something about what sort of deal we would want, irrespective of what positions many of us might or might not have about one day rejoining. What deal would we want a government to be negotiating now? And I think there's 2 key words here, 2 key elements to that. Access and standards. We want a deal that keeps our access to the single market for our supply chains of food and components, access to the single market for our exports with thousands of jobs at stake, access to research programs, access to Erasmus student exchanges, access to the Europol and police and judicial cooperation, and so on and so forth. Keep those elements which individually are often popular with the public, or at least understood by the public, as to why we need to keep something we have and we shouldn't relinquish. The second buzzword, standards. keep our European standards on food safety, no deals with the Americans that lower our standards, our European standards on workers' rights, our European standards on the environment, our European standards of consumer protection. Keep things that we have, that we value. Don't let it be undermined. And that should be our buzzword as Labour in terms of what we want. In positive terms, not just we don't want no deal, we want a deal with these positives in it. We know we won't get it with this government. It will enable us all the better to criticize them afterwards when we don't get it.
So, Richard, let's take some questions from tonight's participants. And I'll call 3 people, and I'll name them now, just so they're ready. So the first 3 will be Alan Nicholson, Catherine Butler, and Monica Threlfall. So, Alan, would you like to kick off? Hopefully you're being unmuted. If not, do it yourself.
What was his surname, sorry? Alan?
Alan Nicholson.
Yep. Okay. Just asked to unmute him now.
Alan, can you unmute yourself?
Right. Okay. Yeah, my question was, what legal action can be taken against the government for the action they're taking?
Okay. If we now go to James Chespy, he's got his hand.
So, oh, no, sorry, we've got Catherine Butler, I called.
Oh, Catherine. Okay. Yep. There you go. I've unmuted Catherine.
Unmute. Yep. Okay. Yes. Hello. Yes. My question was similar. What can we do at the moment legally? Not we. What can be done legally? Is something legal enough to bring the government to account over what they've done? I know the EU, as you said, is going to, says if they don't withdraw this, what they're doing, they will take legal action. But is there some UK law that can stop them? And is any of this enough to bring the government down?
And then Monica Threlfall.
My first question actually was already asked, so I just want to take the opportunity to thank Richard for a very clever answer that I hadn't managed to work out for myself. Because at first my question was don't you think KERR was a bit weak in his response? But you've given that answer, so thank you. Secondly, this is slightly roundabout question, but it is this feeling that the rule of law means less and less in this country because the Prime Minister flaunts it when he wants it. This one, the previous one did as well. And the lack of thinking about, even in the Conservative Party, that you should have a government of law, and that there should be laws here that are to be respected. This they've flaunted so many and are intending to abolish so many more that one wonders, are we living in a banana republic?
Right, okay, over to you, Richard. Are we living in a banana republic?
Well, to start with the banana republic, yeah, this isn't, of course, the only case where the government's shown complete disregard for the rule of law, though it's perhaps one of the ones that will be noticed the most internationally. But one can point to Jenrick and Robert Jenrick is his first name, I can't remember, and planning permission. You can point to Cummings and his trips. You can point to the non-wearing of masks by the Prime Minister himself. There's a whole list of things from the trivial to the important where they create the impression that the law is for other people but not for them. And I think that cumulatively does build up an impression in the public about them. I hope it does, because they deserve to be berated for this. Going back to the first 2 questions, both of which are about what can be done in law about this. Now, in UK law, because I'm not a specialist in this, let me hasten to add, but in UK law, because we have this dualist system that international obligations, international treaties don't apply directly in UK law, but only to the extent that they are then enshrined in domestic legislation by Parliament, the government is able domestically to hide behind this and say the law, as far as our domestic courts are concerned, is what Parliament legislates for. You can ignore our international obligations, that's for us to discuss with other countries. That's a bit of a problem. But in this particular case, the withdrawal agreement, and in particular the protocol on Northern Ireland, which, remember, has already been ratified, is therefore approved by Parliament, that entrenches a degree of European law in domestic legislation, which our courts are supposed to take account of if ever there is a conflict with another UK law and give precedence to that. That preserves a tiny bit, as regards Northern Ireland, the old system of the supremacy of European law over domestic law in the fields that you have European law. And that is where there is a slight opening. And when the EU now is saying we reserve the right to take legal action, there is, of course, in the withdrawal agreement, a mechanism for dispute resolution. And that goes to a disputes panel. But if the question hinges on the interpretation of European law, that they have to ask the view of the European Court of Justice, and they have to follow that, because it's only the European Court can interpret European law. That's quite logical. And therefore, there is the possibility for the EU to take action if the UK is breaking manifestly or not respecting the agreement that it signed and ratified earlier this year.
Okay, before I call the next three, can I just see if there's anyone from the House of Lords who might chip in, as Richard suggested, later. So, you know, use the wave your hand button and let us know. It'd be interested to know what the buzz is from the upper chamber. Okay, next three, I've got Catherine Butler, James Chespy, and Lynne Armstrong. So starting with Catherine.
I cannot see Catherine, so I've unmuted James, and then if I find Catherine afterwards, we'll go to her.
Thank you.
James Chespy.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening, Richard. Good to see you again. Well, I did follow the debate. I did follow the debate in the upper house, and there was no doubt that Lord Keane was on a bit of a loser today. And I never thought I would hear Lord Howard of Limpt comment the words that he commented, and I think if nobody heard them, I think they were quite strong, and I'll mention them before I ask my questions. He said this: "My lords, does my noble and learned friend simply not understand the damage done to our reputation for probity and respect for the rule of law by those 5 words uttered by his ministerial colleague in another place on Tuesday? Words that I thought I would never hear from a British minister, far less a Conservative minister. How can we reproach Russia, China, or Iran when their conduct falls below internationally accepted standards, when we are showing such scant regard for our treaty obligations?" Well, I think that's of all the speeches in the upper place today, that really took me by surprise, because I never thought Lord Howard, a Brexiteer, right-winger, but he showed he had a bit of integrity. I really don't know where we're going to go with this, because, you know, as a Labour Party, we are well behind in the Commons. You know, when you think about it, there was more MPs in 1931, Labour MPs in 1931 than there are today, and that's a reality of the situation we're in. But, you know, we say we are, you know, the three pillars upon which our democracy stands: sovereignty of Parliament, independence of the judiciary, and the rule of law. And I simply want to ask you, Richard, if the government are sort of playing fast and loose with the rule of law in respect of this UK Markets Bill, does that mean that the rest of us can play fast and loose with the rule of law?
Okay, well, we'll leave that question hanging and then wait for Lynne Armstrong. Hello, Lynne. We can see you, but we can't hear you. Harry, what's going on?
I've unmuted Lynne, but we don't seem to be able to hear her. So if it's okay, if you could type your question in into the chat box for us, and then we'll come back. Richard can come back and answer it in a minute. So if maybe meanwhile we just go on to the next person.
Okay, so I've got Kevin Sean Rogers. Is Kevin here?
Yep. I'm just unmuting Kevin now.
Hello. All right.
Yeah, go for it.
I think Boris will do a no deal. I think he'll do a no deal hard Brexit. I can't see him track the European budget, and I can't see it happening. But if he extends it, my friend lives in Finland. He thinks Boris if he extends it, there'll be a backlash from the Brexiteers. So he'd probably do no deal, I reckon.
Okay. Well, do you want to pick that up, Richard?
Yes, well, the last one was a comment and rather than a question, and I think indeed that's quite plausible. As I said, there are different movements within the Conservative Party, and Johnson may well go with those who don't want no deal, but it's not certain. He's rather unpredictable, as we know. Yeah. On Michael Howard, yes, the former leader of the Conservative Party, very right-wing, very Eurosceptic, yet even he is speaking out against this particular point of the breaking of the agreements as regards the Northern Ireland Protocol. But of course, it's also possible that the government backs down on that and everybody then heaves a sigh of relief, and then they get away with everything else they're trying to do. This could be a decoy, couldn't it? We don't know. But let's not forget that the sort of deal they're going for anyway, irrespective of all this, is one that distances ourselves from our European partners. Even if there is a deal, it's going to be a bare bones deal, a minimalist deal, that essentially keeps us out of the single market and the customs union, certainly the customs union, and which will be damaging for Britain.
Yeah.
Because after all, there's a central dilemma with Brexit for any government pursuing Brexit. If you leave the European Union, you have to make difficult choices.
Yeah.
You distance yourself outside the customs union, outside the single market, outside all the other things, and then you have a huge economic hit. Or you attenuate that hit, you don't eliminate it, but you lessen it by keeping close to Europe, preferably inside the customs union, but certainly aligned to the single market, so you have unfettered access to it. But then you have to follow European rules without any more having a say on them. Now, neither is good for Britain, frankly. That's why we were against Brexit in the first place. If you are having to make that choice, in this situation where we're already facing a huge economic downturn because of COVID, you would surely want to take the choice that keeps us close, keeps our access to that market, even if we do have to follow the rules. Let's not forget we helped make those rules, so they're not terrible things, at least to over the years. And over time, then, you can then see where that takes you. But to go now into an immediate economic hit on top of the hit we're getting from the repercussions of COVID, that is a disaster.
So Lynn has typed her question into the chat box for you, Richard. She says, "Hi Richard, what is your opinion on the role of Dominic Cummings in the Johnson government policy? Certainly not Western Europe." Oh, Richard, you're muted.
Yeah, I mute myself when somebody else is speaking. Yes, well, Dominic Cummings, I think, is clearly one of the main drivers of the of driving the Conservative government policy towards that extreme neoliberal, no deal, keep ourselves distanced from the European Union line. Remember, he has a long history. He ran the Vote Leave campaign with, which broke the law, even then already, which exceeded spending limits and which told multiple lies. He ran the referendum campaign opposed to introducing alternative vote, if you remember that. He ran the referendum campaign against devolution to the northeast, if you remember that. He has a lot of experience of manipulating public opinion by various techniques, including all the latest modern data techniques that we're only just getting to grips with in the Labour Party. But he is on the far right of the political spectrum.
Okay, if we take the next 3 rounds of questions, there's already people who've clicked the button to tell us they've got their hand raised. So if we go to Kate Freeman. Kate, I'm unmuting you now.
Hello, Richard. I completely support your idea of campaigning for access to all the various EU advantages and maintaining our standards. That's vital. But bearing in mind the rule of 6, COVID, and having a very Brexity MP, how would you advise us to campaign to achieve what we mutually would like to achieve? What is the best method?
Okay, thank you, Kate. And now we go to Larry Whitty. Just unmuted you now.
Thank you. Don did call for a few from the House of Lords, and I'll try and give one. The House of Lords will rightly be outraged at this, and almost certainly will vote down those provisions in the Internal Market Bill, which are actually even more outrageous than people have said, because they actually say not only can you override the terms of the withdrawal agreement, but you can override any piece of national or international law which conflicts with what the government now intend to do. So I think the House of Lords' constitutional position will be raised and will be fairly vociferously pursued. But of course, at the end of the day, we can't win. And there is the other complication, but actually the House of Lords didn't like the withdrawal agreement in the first place. And indeed, the withdrawal agreement in itself is contradictory in that you cannot at the same time prevent any border being raised in Ireland, and at the same time not have a border down the Irish Sea. And the logic of that has always been there. Boris, at the time of doing the deal, was prepared to sell out the Unionists. He now may be in a position that he's provoking the Irish, i.e. the EU, to actually put some boundaries, some at least indirect restrictions on the border. So I think he is playing a more clever game than being outrageous. If the Lords defeat it, the Commons will probably in the end defeat us, but in the meantime we will be seen in the Lords as the enemies of the people. Any judge that upholds it will be the enemies of the people, and Europeans will clearly be the enemies of the people. So that plays their whole extreme Brexiteer position. He will lose a few people in the Conservative Party in that respect, in my view, and he will lose some of the press support. But nevertheless, this is the trajectory which he and Dominic Cummings are on. And the Lords will have to decide. I think we should take a strong stand. But after the ping pong, when it moves between the two houses, there may well be a move to say, well, okay, we've tried, but in the end of the day, the elected house wins. And if Johnson can keep the Tory party and the Commons together, then the Lords won't be able to stop him, and we'll be in a situation of peers versus the people, judges versus the people, and the British against Europe. And it's an agenda that has worked for him before. So I'm a bit depressed.
Okay, thank you, Larry. And then one more question. Sash. Oh, if we just go over to Tim for one more question and then go back to Richard to respond. Tim, I've unmuted you.
Great. Thank you. This is a really great discussion. Kind of a two-part question, if I can. I think one of the things that we've talked a lot about is, does Boris want a no-deal Brexit? I think I'm kind of also interested in the question of, at this late moment, given the significant distrust among our European partners, do you think there is still the desire to be willing to have a deal with the UK? And I mean, especially given what we've seen happen today and the general behaviour of the UK government. And in fact, is there a sense, do you think, Richard, amongst European partners that Brexit is not a big issue in the press and the media outside the UK, and is there a sense that maybe going ahead with no deal, perhaps not deliberately, but in the end it may be the inevitable outcome? The other thing I wanted to ask is, we've not talked very much in this meeting about what we do as a Labour Party in terms of how we take this forward, and I think what worries me is that we have had some conversation in the media about the potential immediate impacts of no deal, but I think there's a whole range of impacts. As you know, 50% of our economy is based on services. We still haven't got a clear idea of what the services arrangement will look like at the beginning of next year. So I'd love your thoughts on what should we be doing now as a Labour Party in terms of highlighting this issue, talking about the implications of no deal, not trying to let the Tories blame the EU for what happens, and to really highlight the kind of both the short but the medium and long-term impacts on the country, if that's the direction that we end up taking. Thank you.
Okay, so Richard, would you like to have a go at those? Can I just throw in the thought about what's happening with public opinion? We know that Labour has level pegging with the Tories in at least some polls, and there's been some interesting stuff from Peter Kellner saying that there has been a swing to Labour in the red wall seats. Now, I think that all may have a bearing on what happens, especially as the impact of no Brexit agreement, will be felt next year. At the moment, nothing's happened. Nobody's feeling any pain from this. So things might start to change when the deal is done and the Tories have done their worst. Anyway, over to you, Richard.
Thank you. Lots of food for thought there in those questions. On Kate's first question, how to campaign, especially if you're in a seat with a Tory Brexiteer. I live in Shipley, where I've got Philip Davis. You can hardly be more right-wing and Brexity than him. But when I say campaign for access, campaign to keep our standards, I don't have any illusions that we're going to convince the government of this. This is laying down a marker in public opinion to say that's what the sort of deal we need, that's what we want as a country, put pressure on them. And when that's not delivered, we can say that's what should have been delivered. Most of those things correspond, by the way, to promises that they made at one point or another, because they made a lot of promises about Brexit that aren't going to come true. And that will then be a theme that we can exploit. Brexit ain't what was promised. It's not what they said it would be. It's not delivering the things they said it would deliver. And we can build that up afterwards when we get either a bad minimal deal or no deal, and we can make that case. This goes also to what Tim was one of the things Tim was asking about. And we've got to make sure that the blame game then is on them not delivering what they promised, not what they will do, and blame either COVID for the recession or the EU for being nasty to us, as they will say. And we've got to make sure the blame lays where the blame goes where it should. Larry, I think, was right. Very interesting what Larry said about the situation in the House of Lords. And he was right as well to say that this bill is about much more than that. I described it earlier as an enabling act. It will enable the government to rewrite all kinds of laws beyond the narrow scope of the Northern Ireland arrangements and the protocol. It's a very sinister piece of legislation. But my thought, though, Larry, is if the House of Lords does amend it, those amendments go back to the House of Commons, and yes, normally the Commons then just simply overrules them. But it does give an additional peg for any Tory rebels. There will have to be another vote. Some of those amendments may have been tabled in the House of Lords by Conservatives. That might make it slightly easier for Tory rebels to vote that way in the House of Commons. So Lords amendments can be used to encourage rebellions in the governing party in the House of Commons. Now, that being said, it's a tall order. They've got a pretty hefty majority. You need at least 40 to cross the floor, as it were, or vote the other way against the government. But it's certainly worth trying, in my humble opinion. You will have a much better view of this than I do, Larry, but it seems to me that it's worth going down that route. What's the Lords there for? Yeah, okay, it's usually overruled, but there's no point in not trying it, is there? Go ahead, I'd say, go ahead. And then coming back to Tim's last questions, other questions, sorry. The EU reaction to this. I met this morning David McAllister, MEP, who's the head of the European Parliament Brexit Task Force, as it used to be called, and it's now the Task Force on EU-UK relations. David McAllister succeeded Verhofstadt in this respect, and he's a German MEP who's half British, as his name sort of indicates. So he knows the issues, he follows it closely. Now, his degree of consternation about this went even beyond what I was expecting. He just met Barnier last night, who himself is distraught that such a grenade has been thrown in the negotiations at the very last minute, without even the courtesy of informing them in advance about this, which is what you would normally do in an open, honest negotiation between partners about problems as you see them arising. How can we solve them? It's not that sort of negotiation at all. And the mood, the hostility that this has provoked is immense. In Politico today, the Brussels edition, and I'll read here, it says, the view from Brussels, EU officials are shocked and enraged. The general mood certainly isn't good. There is a sense of frustration in the EU that the 3 years it has spent in negotiations may have been in vain. Regret about all the efforts expended by highly qualified and well-paid civil servants in search of solutions to a problem that they never asked for, and has led to a certain inclination among some diplomats to say, good riddance to Britain. Now, that's actually quite alarming from a British point of view, if that's the mood. They just are fed up to the teeth with us. They are ready to call it off. Now, I think they won't, because they don't want to give Boris Johnson the pleasure of being able to blame the EU for calling off the talks. They will persevere. They will say, yes, we're open to trying again, to exploring further. They won't fall into his trap, because just as with Keir Starmer, he's laying traps for the EU so as to be able to blame others for his own failures. But that certainly is, I think, an accurate view of the mood underneath the surface in Brussels.
Okay, Richard. So what I'm going to suggest is that we've got half a dozen people waiting to ask questions. So that'll be 2 rounds of 3, and then that may be a good time to draw stumps or whatever the right metaphor is. So the next 3 will be Michael Elliott, Sandy Martin, and Nella Ashton. So if Harry can unmute Michael Elliott, that would be good.
Michael, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Richard, in this debate up to the general election, we made a great deal of influence in the situation by drawing attention to the way in which leaving the European Union would undermine, or at the very least endanger, many of the safeguards in terms of rights and other issues which some of us spend such a lot of time building up, things like Chespy and so on. Do you think we should now be challenging the Tories to come clean about this? They said at the time, oh, well, don't worry, we'll bring our own legislation in. Should we not be saying to them now, look, you promised that you would introduce British legislation to ensure that proper standards in environment and workers' rights and other things would be undermined, to ask them if they would now come forward with their own firm proposals that we could debate in Parliament and elsewhere?
Okay, so Sandy Martin.
Sandy, you're unmuted.
Ah, right, good. Hi, Richard. Yes, I mean, all through the referendum campaign, we won all the arguments. And if you look at the presidential election campaign in 2016 in America, Hillary won all the arguments. We were very good at winning the arguments in various countries. It doesn't seem to make that much difference to what happens in elections. Being right about things doesn't seem to be the main object of the exercise. How are we going to deal with this complete disconnect between logic and truth on the one hand, and the way that people feel and vote on the other hand?
Okay, next question from Nella Ashton.
Hello, good evening. My sense is that this bill and the way that basically that the government.
Oh, Nella, we've lost you. We can't hear you at the moment.
One thing I'm wondering
we can hear you again.
Okay, you can hear me. Oh, hi. Okay, so you've not heard anything I just said.
No.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. What I'm saying is that they seem to be heading for a dictatorship. They seem to be wanting absolute control. They basically grab everything. And what I am not sure that I understand is, because if that is going to come to fruition, they need the backing of the army. But my understanding is that the army is quite depleted, and in fact, they recently have been actually quite tried.
Right. Okay, Richard, there's an interesting one. Richard.
Shall I answer those 3? Yeah. Okay. Michael Elliott,
Yes,
lovely
yes.
to see you, Michael. Yes, in principle, they said we will introduce in UK law standards equivalent to those that we've had at EU level and on a whole range of things, but they haven't, and that is something we should be chasing them on. Of course, even if they do, that doesn't necessarily guarantee equivalence with EU standards to the extent that the EU would find satisfactory in terms of access to their market. Because what happens in a few years' time if the EU raises its standards on, say, consumer protection, and the UK doesn't? If we're not aligning dynamically, then there will be divergence. And then if we have full and unfettered access for our products to their market, we will be competing in that market on the basis of lower standards than they have, be that workers' rights, environmental standards, food labelling, consumer protection rules, you name it. That's one thing the EU fears. And of course, the EU's common standards for the common market across the whole of Europe come with an ecosystem of common rules and common enforcement mechanisms and checking mechanisms, and if necessary, a common court, the European Court of Justice, to adjudicate if you've not solved it at lower levels. Having equivalent looking standards in a separate legal system and standards that might diverge anyway is, of course, a problem for the future relationship if we're outside the single market. But you're right to raise that. Sandy Martin, yes, this is an increasing problem in politics, isn't it? There's a host of issues, and Europe was obviously clearly one of them, where we feel the arguments are clear, but the one-line populist attack wins out. There are so many issues in the referendum and since where the Eurosceptic right gives a one-line attack on the European Union, where the answer requires an explanation. And because it requires 5-6 minutes to explain, to reply to a one-liner, you're at a disadvantage already. Now that's becoming true of a wide sphere of politics, not just about the EU debate. It was very visible and came to the fore at that level, but we have to think about how to campaign in this new world where that sort of campaigning is sadly so effective. And you're right, we saw it in America as well as here. And we perhaps have to be a little bit populist ourselves, perhaps, in our thinking of short, clear, one-line answers and one-line attacks on their positions. And Neela's question about, are we heading for dictatorship? I mean, when you see the government that the Prime Minister that was willing to prorogue Parliament, that now wants to introduce legislation to reduce judicial review of government actions, to neuter the courts, that is increasingly manipulative of the press. Large parts of the press are owned by supporters of this government anyway, but those that aren't, the boycott of certain news channels that they refuse to appear on, the favoritism shown to journalists who are on their side, all those things added together is something we've never seen before in Britain. And now the systematic removal of top civil servants that don't see things their way. We really are in uncharted waters here, and I'm not sure you cut out when you got onto the army. I'm not sure we're getting how far that question was going to lead, but we really do need to build the case cross-party, across all democratic parties and the remaining democratic conservatives who are uneasy about this, to say this government is stepping beyond what is acceptable in British democratic life.
Okay, so I've now got 4 people who want to ask questions. So I'm going to do 2 pairs. So next pair, Nicholas KERR, or KERR, and Paul Fisher. So Nicholas, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for being here this evening. I wondered whether or not to ask this question, but actually follows on from what you've just been saying in answer to the question about becoming a dictatorship. Because from very, very shortly after the referendum, my feeling was that we were beginning to live in the shadow of 1930s Germany. I know that sounds really very dramatic, but nothing that's happened over the last 4 years has really done anything to dissuade me from that point of view. And watching the antics of Cummings and the antics of the Prime Minister, before we came on together, I watched Prime Minister's Question Time from yesterday, and the Prime Minister again and again repeats the most appalling. I mean, his behaviour at the dispatch box is disgraceful. I just wondered whether, if we look back to the 30s Germany, there is anything that we can learn from what did or did not happen to stop the rise of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party, that we can bring in, and I'm particularly troubled by the fact that the unintended consequence of the act that was introduced by the coalition government, which gives us fixed-term parliament, now presents us with the necessity, particularly given the Prime Minister's overwhelming majority, of waiting until 2024 before we can even challenge the government and hope to unseat what is an appalling and really gravely threatening junta.
Okay, thanks for that. Can we have Paul Fisher and a little bit of a plea for slightly shorter questions, please?
Good evening. Does the Labour Party have a policy on rejoin? If so, what is it? I hope that's short enough.
Richard.
Thank you. On the comparisons with 1930s Germany, they are clever enough not to do things that are obviously like the far right in the 1930s. The modern far right, part of which is in part of the Conservative Party and part of which is outside the Conservative Party, don't go strutting down streets wearing black shirts, brown shirts or blue shirts with particular forms of salutes and flags. A few did, very, very, very few. They're clever enough to avoid the things that the general public would associate when you say 1930s Germany or 1920s, 30s Italy or things like that as a direct comparison. The overt, explicit, visual comparisons they keep away from. But a lot of the things that they are doing in what they're saying, in the way they are acting, the demonization of judges, enemies of the people, the manipulations of the media, the disregard for what we have assumed up to now were normal democratic practices in Britain and in the British Parliament. All that adds up to something that can certainly be compared to 1930s in Germany. And that's why the situation is so alarming. Now, what lessons can we learn from 1930s Germany? One is that the opposition parties need to hold together. One reason why Hitler came to power was the vicious fighting between other parties that enabled him to, and the collusion of some other parties that enabled him to become Chancellor in 1933. We've got to make sure we build the widest possible coalition of parties that, even if they don't make a formal coalition together, are willing at least to cooperate on preventing Johnson going further. Though, of course, that being said, as already mentioned, given his majority in the House of Commons, we're already in a very dangerous situation there.
Okay, so we come to our last two.
There was one other question I've noted down. What did Paul ask me? I can't read my writing, sorry. No, never mind. Perhaps I did answer it.
Okay, so last two questions.
Sorry. Paul asked me what the Labour Party's position was on rejoining. Well, the Labour Party's not got a formal position on rejoining. I think the prevailing view in the leadership levels of the party is that that's not the issue at the moment. The issue at the moment is these negotiations that ideally we would like to see keeping us close to the European Union are unlikely to, and we don't know exactly what sort of mess we're going to be in just 2 or 3 months' time, let alone afterwards. That being said, there are plenty of people in the Labour Party who do want us to rejoin one day, but realistically that's not going to be an issue for the next few months at least.
Okay, so the last two questioners, Claire Hill and Jeffrey Harris. Claire, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I'm just wondering what effect this will have on I'm in Ireland at the moment, on the situation with Ireland. Will we still, I'm not sure if I've got the terminology right, we have the common agricultural area, so people go to England to work and live, and people go from England to Ireland to work and live. Can you foresee that continuing? Or will it be affected by this?
Okay, and now Jeffrey Harris, last but not least, as they say.
Well, having come in last, I think my points have already been answered, so I will summarize my thoughts very, very briefly. First of all, you asked for a point of view from the House of Lords, and Larry Whitty gave us, I think, a rather succinct summary of the situation with a very important line which we probably refused to hear, which was, do we still think Boris Johnson doesn't know what he's doing? He's known what he's doing. Of course, he improvises and he plays tricks and he tricks his own cabinet and his family with the rest of it. But I mean, he's got himself in quite a strong position now. And what I don't understand is, even if there's a court case, isn't the situation that if the British government does not withdraw what appears to be a sort of flagship piece of policy, even if it's a surprise piece of policy, if they don't withdraw it, negotiate, the time the Court of Justice comes back to it, I mean, it'll be ancient history, and it's the kind of thing which would, I don't know, you know better than I do about how backfire. Sure, you know, are we going back to the 1930s? Well, the trouble is, Richard and friends, that in Poland, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, we are going back to the 1930s. They're slightly inside the EU. There are countries in a much worse position than we are. We've even got a country like Cyprus, which blocks sanctions on Belarus when they're beating people over the head in the full view of the people. So the EU itself has a lot of problems, and much as my heart would tell me something else, to ask Keir Starmer to take on the whole course of events and turn them around, he did his best under the previous regime, and as Richard neatly summarised, it was a very sort of hesitant position in the general election, and the Labour Party got smashed. So his job is to try and put some life back into the Labour Party, and in that context, looking at the threats to democracy is perhaps a good place to start, and I'm confident taking on the issues of the constitutional powers the government is taking through itself, smashing up the union, getting all powers into his own hands, and smashing up the BBC, taking control of the media, and undertaking a kind of cultural. These things are really bad news, and they are the kinds of things which I think might motivate the Labour Party to think about Europe. Okay, I will stop. To think about Europe in the real political context, which is a very, very dangerous one, with Russia, and let alone what happens in the United States. So I would say give Starmer a chance. Don't abandon the idea of rejoining, but it's clearly a question of helping him put some life back into the party and the European cause itself, which is challenged all over the place. It's a pretty uninspiring moment in the life of the EU, apart from the other huge stresses. And shouldn't Labour Party really be moving more in the moving on.
Okay,
without
so
abandoning its ideas.
maybe we can get Richard to respond to that now. Richard, over to you.
Right, thanks. Claire's question on the effects on Ireland. Ireland is the EU member state that stands to be hurt the most by Brexit generally, but especially if it's a damaging Brexit that distances Britain from the rest of Europe. Now, there are some specificities about Ireland. One is the common travel area with the UK. That will not be affected. The rights of citizens of both countries to go and live and work and travel to, without further ado, each other's countries, both of which are outside Schengen, will not be affected. Cross-border trade in goods and services should not be affected. That was the whole point of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Very important for Irish agriculture as well as manufacturing, because there's a huge amount of cross-border trade at the moment, supply chains going back and forth, and any impediment to that would be dramatic. That's why the Northern Ireland Protocol is so important, that makes sure that that border doesn't become an effective border when it comes to customs, tariffs, or regulatory controls. So that's the potential threat to Ireland, is this unravelling of the Northern Ireland Protocol. On Jeff's question, now Jeff faded in and out a little bit with the microphone. And now he started off referencing Larry, and of course Jeff and I wrote a pamphlet in the 1980s called A Socialist Policy for Europe, and I remember us handing it to Larry Whitty when he was General Secretary of the Labour Party in Brussels. I think at the time you weren't best pleased with everything we'd written in it, though I'm sure almost all of it became party policy sometime, a few years maybe afterwards, but it was nice to be reminded of that when Jeff spoke. Now, Jeff's right to recall that some of the same political patterns that we've seen in Britain, with the rise of a hard right, perhaps far right, is to be seen in other European countries, and the situation in Hungary, Poland, and so on is alarming. We often look at Brexit and what's happened to our politics in isolation, but it's part of a wider pattern, not just in Europe. Look at Trump's America, look at Brazil, look at India. There's a number of countries where the rise of right-wing male dictators or near dictators is the pattern of politics, and where they are playing on racist, nationalistic discourses. So let's always remember, we're not an isolated case that's different and exceptional from the rest of the world. These are parts of wider battles as well. But Jeff's conclusion, give KERR a chance, I think is right. We could all, those of us who are passionate Europeans, can always very easily say, why isn't he going a bit further? Why isn't he already saying this? Why isn't he being more explicit on that? Yeah, maybe he could be a little bit, but he's the best chance we've got by a mile. He's clever. He's dealing with Boris Johnson in a way which is producing results. The opinion polls show that. And by focusing on the sheer incompetence of the government and not playing into their hands when they want to divert him into culture wars or anything else, that for the moment is working to a degree, and it would pave the way, because remember, nothing beneficial can happen unless we oust the Conservatives at the next election, whenever that is, and have a Labour government. Then we can still have room for argument about how far we can go, how quickly, on a number of issues, including our relationship with Europe. But unless we get to that point of winning the next election, then it's all for academic debate, frankly. And so I think we have to rally behind KERR, give him a chance, and let's make sure that that chance is one that we take.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Great last line. Give KERR a chance. So that's the end of all our